Hi, Mr. Maciejewski here, and I'm so happy to have you in our class. If you're seeing this video, it means that you are in our Google Classroom and that you're interested in finding out about some of our grading policies. So first, I thought it would be important to discuss some of my grading beliefs based on educational research and my experience as a teacher for these past 8 years. Firstly, I know that grades are one of the first things students and parents use to check in and see how students are doing in a given class. So to me, grades need to be very explicit what they mean, and how grades are created also need to be very clear so students can understand what to do to improve. Now, I've created, based on my past 8 years of practice as well as research, a system that I think does those two things very well. In addition to being clear to students, I've tried to create a system that also most fairly represents where the students actually are in mastering the skills that we're working on. So I offer the analogy of a runner. I recently started running, and when I first ran my first 5K, my run time for that 5K race was not very good. It was 40 minutes. Yeah, pretty slow. But I kept running on my own. I kept practicing. I would use an app on my phone to help me practice getting faster and running sprints and running longer distances on 5K to help my endurance. And the second race I ran it in 29 minutes. It was a year apart, so there was a lot of time in between. But I had a lot of practice in between too. Now, how would you evaluate me as a runner? Would you average the 40 minutes and the 29 minutes together? Well, so 69 divided by 2 is 34 and a half. That's not a very fast 5K time, and it's also not representative of what I can run right now. And based on my research in education, that's what averaging all of assignments throughout a quarter does, is it says, well, I see you had very little skill at the beginning. You had a ton of practice for 10 weeks, but yet I'm going to look at the entirety of these things instead of seeing that realistically, if we had 10 weeks of practice for running, going back to the running analogy, you wouldn't run the 40-minute mile again. You wouldn't run the 5K mile again, or we wouldn't expect you to if you were actually practicing. And so I believe education is a lot like that. These are skills we're developing, and we should fairly assess you, and your grade should represent where you are at that most current moment. So there are some things that we do differently in this class grade-wise that help reflect that. First and foremost, there are no zeros for assignments. A zero factored in would negatively be an outlier and not representative of what you can do skill-wise. It says you didn't turn anything in, not that you can't do it. You don't have zero skill in any area such as inferencing or reading for meaning or something like that. So how do we account for that? Well, we account for zeros by having a work completion average, which is averaged every week. And the rubric for work completion is on our Google Classroom About page. You can see that there, and you'll see that it's very fair. It's all about turning work in on time without being asked. And the amount of teacher intervention needed to get work back in on time determines your work completion grade. That is averaged every week. So if you earned a 100 one week and a 100 the next week, your average is a 100, very simply. If you earned a 100 and a 90 the next week, your average is a 95. It's very simple because that's a habit. That's not a skill we're developing. However, I do calculate skills a little bit differently to make sure, like I said, that we are actually giving credit to where you are at currently with that skill, knowing that your most recent assessment, be it a checklist, a annotation check, diagram, notes, essay, traditional pen and paper test, computer test, anything like that, group presentation, all of those things, if they're the most recent assessment, should be demonstrating your highest level of skill attained thus far. So I give the most weight to that. That's called the decaying average. Okay, so let's take a look at how decaying averages work. Let's say that we have Jane East and we've had 3 assessments on the skill of inferencing. She's earned a 60, an 80, and a 90. Now, if you were to just average those 3 together, typically the score would be 76.6 repeating, so most people would say 76.7 or 77 because WITS doesn't do decimal point averages for individual grades, so 77. However, because I believe very strongly, and the research supports me, that a student's last assessment is most likely the highest amount of skill they can demonstrate independently on an area, you can see that when calculating averages in a skill, the first assessment is given 30% of the weight, and the second assessment is given 70%. When we have 3 assessments, what happens is the averages compiled between the last average, so in this case it would have been Jane's 74, and then the most recent assessment, which then gets the 70%. Based on educational research, this is very common sense because of the fact that we're getting more practice in class, we're expecting you to practice independently, and so it is in the student's best interest to weight most recent assignments more heavily, because with more practice should come more demonstrable skill, and it's just fair to the students to try to represent their highest level of achievement in that area. So remember, on WITS, what you'll see is one average for inferencing, or whatever skill we have, and an average for each of the other skills we're practicing, plus one average for class participation and one for work completion, which I've already talked about.